Hello friend, in this video we will understand each chapter from the book of Genesis. Don't forget to like and share this video to help the channels to share the word of God. We hope you enjoy it. God bless you. Chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. At first, the earth was formless and empty, with darkness covering the deep waters, but the Spirit of God was present, hovering over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. He saw that the light was good and separated it from the darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. This was the first day. On the second day, God created an expanse in the midst of the waters to divide the waters from the waters. He called this expanse the sky. On the third day, God gathered the waters under the sky to one place, allowing the dry land to appear. He called the dry land earth and the gathering of waters seas. Then, he commanded the earth to bring forth grass, herbs yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, and it was so. God saw that it was good. On the fourth day, God created lights in the sky to divide the day from the night, and to be for signs, seasons, days, and years. He also made the two great lights, the sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light to the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. He saw that it was good. On the fifth day, God created swarms of living creatures in the water and birds that fly in the sky. He blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." On the sixth day, God created living creatures on the earth, including cattle, creeping things, and animals of the earth. Then, he said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So, God created man in his own image, male and female. He blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Finally, God provided food for all living creatures. He gave every herb yielding seed and every tree bearing fruit for humans to eat, and every green herb for animals to eat. When God saw everything that he had made, it was very good. The sixth day ended with evening and morning, marking the completion of creation. Chapter 2. After God created the heavens and the earth, and all the host of them. On the seventh day, God rested, having completed his work. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy. This is the history of the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created. At the time of creation, no plant of the field had yet sprung up, nor was there a man to till the ground. However, a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Yahweh God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. God then planted a garden eastward, in Eden, and put the man he had formed in it. Out of the ground, Yahweh God made every tree to grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. He also made the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river went out of Eden to water the garden, and it was parted and became four heads. Yahweh God put the man into the Garden of Eden to dress it and keep it. He commanded the man, saying that he could freely eat of every tree of the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He warned the man that in the day he ate of it, he would surely die. God then created every animal of the field and every bird of the sky and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. The man gave names to all the animals, but for him, there was not found a helper suitable for him. Yahweh God caused a deep sleep to fall on the man and took one of his ribs, making it into a woman. The man called her woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man will leave his father and his mother and be joined with his wife, and they will be one flesh. At this point, both the man and his wife were naked, and they were not ashamed. Chapter 3. The story recounts how the serpent, described as the most cunning animal in the field, convinced Eve to eat from the forbidden tree in the Garden of Eden. The serpent questioned whether God had really forbidden them to eat from any tree in the garden, and Eve corrected him, saying that they were only forbidden to eat from the tree in the middle of the garden, lest they die. The serpent then lied, telling Eve that she would not die, but instead, her eyes would be opened, and she would be like God, knowing good and evil. Eve saw that the tree was good for food and a delight to the eyes, and she desired the wisdom it could give her. She took the fruit and ate it, and then gave some to her husband Adam, who also ate it. Both their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together to make aprons to cover themselves. God came into the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and Eve hid from him. God called out to Adam, asking where he was, and Adam replied that he was afraid and had hidden because he was naked. God asked if he had eaten from the tree that he had commanded him not to eat from, and Adam admitted that he had, blaming Eve for giving him the fruit. Eve also admitted to eating the fruit, blaming the serpent for deceiving her. God then cursed the serpent, telling him that he would crawl on his belly and eat dust for the rest of his life. He also put enmity between the serpent and the woman, and between their offspring. He prophesied that the woman's offspring would crush the serpent's head, while the serpent would only bruise the offspring's heel. God then told the woman that he would greatly increase her pain in childbirth, and her desire would be for her husband, who would rule over her. He told Adam that because he listened to his wife's voice and ate from the tree, the ground would be cursed, and he would have to toil to eat from it. Thorns and thistles would grow, and he would eat the herb of the field by the sweat of his face until he returned to the ground from which he came, for he was made from dust and would return to dust. Adam named his wife Eve, and God made coats of skins to clothe them. God then sent them out of the Garden of Eden, and placed cherubs at the east of the garden, with a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Chapter 4. In the beginning, a man named Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to a son named Cain, with the help of Yahweh. Later, she gave birth to Abel, who was a keeper of sheep, while Cain became a tiller of the ground. As time passed, Cain and Abel both offered gifts to Yahweh. Abel's offering of the firstborn of his flock was respected, but Cain's offering of fruits from the ground was not. Yahweh questioned Cain's anger and warned him about sin's desire for him, but Cain ignored the warning and killed his brother Abel in a fit of rage. When Yahweh asked about Abel's whereabouts, Cain denied any knowledge and was cursed to be a fugitive and a wanderer. He also lamented his punishment and feared being killed by anyone who found him. Yahweh protected Cain by appointing a sign for him, and he went on to build a city and have descendants, including Lamech, who took 2 wives and had children. Jabal was the father of those who dwell in tents and have cattle, while Jubal was the father of all who handle the harp and pipe. Tubal-Cain, the forger of cutting instruments of brass and iron, was also among Lamech's children. Lamech boasted to his wives about killing a man and declared that he would be avenged 77 times, unlike Cain, who was protected despite his crime. Adam and Eve also had another son named Seth, whom Eve considered a replacement for Abel, and Seth went on to have a son named Enosh. It was during Enosh's time that men began to call upon Yahweh's name. Chapter 5. The passage tells the story of the generations of Adam and his descendants, leading up to the birth of Noah. It starts by describing how God created man in his own likeness and blessed them, naming them Adam. Adam eventually became the father of Seth, who went on to have many sons and daughters. The genealogy then continues with the story of Seth's son Enosh, who became the father of Kenan, and Kenan who became the father of Mahalalel, who was the father of Jared, and so on. Each generation lived for hundreds of years, with some living for almost a millennium, according to the Bible. The text notes how each man lived after the birth of his first son, fathering many more children. One individual in this lineage, Enoch, is described as having walked with God. Enoch lived for 365 years, which is believed to have biblical significance, and then was taken by God, not experiencing death. The text also mentions Methuselah, who was the oldest person recorded in the Bible, living for 969 years. Finally, the text focuses on Lamech, who became the father of Noah. Lamech named his son Noah, meaning comfort, and prophesied that he would bring relief from the hard work and toil of the people, due to the ground being cursed by Yahweh. The text ends with the statement that Noah was 500 years old when he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. While this passage is mainly a genealogy, it provides valuable insights into the early beliefs of the Judeo-Christian tradition, as well as an interesting glimpse into ancient cultural practices. The text tells us that people during this time believed in a long lifespan, and that they considered it important to trace their family history. It also shows the importance of naming conventions, as multiple generations were given the same name, and the significance of the meaning of names in biblical times. The story of Enoch, who is taken directly to heaven, is also intriguing and provides fodder for theological discussions. Chapter 6. In the early days when men began to populate the earth, they had daughters who were beautiful. The sons of God saw these daughters and took them as wives for themselves. However, God became concerned about the increasing wickedness of man and decided that his spirit would no longer strive with them. He announced that man's days would be limited to 120 years. During this time, there were Nephilim on the earth, the offspring of God's sons and men's daughters. They were mighty men, renowned for their strength and power. God saw the evil that was spreading across the earth and became sorry that he had created man. He decided to destroy all living things on earth, including animals, creeping things, and birds of the sky. But Noah found favor in God's eyes. Noah was a righteous man and walked with God. He was blameless among the people of his time and became the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. God saw that the earth was corrupt and filled with violence and decided to destroy all living things. However, God established a covenant with Noah and his family. They were to build an ark, made of gopher wood, and bring 2 of every living creature, male and female, into it. The ark was to be 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in breadth, and 30 cubits in height. It was to have rooms and be sealed both inside and outside with pitch. Noah was to make a roof in the ark and a door on the side of it. There were to be lower, second, and third levels in the ark. Noah obeyed God's commandments and built the ark according to God's instructions. Noah and his family entered the ark with the animals, creeping things, and birds of the sky. They also brought with them food for themselves and the animals. Then, God brought the flood of waters on the earth, destroying all flesh that had the breath of life. The flood continued for 40 days and 40 nights until the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. As the waters receded, Noah sent out a dove to see if it could find dry land. Eventually, the dove returned with an olive leaf in its beak, indicating that the waters had receded enough for Noah and his family to leave the ark. When they left the ark, God made a covenant with Noah, promising that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. Chapter 7. In the book of Genesis, Yahweh spoke to Noah, telling him to gather his household and enter the ark, as Yahweh saw Noah's righteousness before him in this generation. Noah was instructed to take 7 pairs of every clean animal, both male and female, and 2 of every unclean animal. Additionally, 7 pairs of every bird of the sky, both male and female, were to be brought into the ark to keep the seed alive on the surface of the earth. Yahweh then told Noah that in 7 days, he would cause it to rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, destroying every living thing that he had made from the surface of the ground. Noah followed Yahweh's instructions and gathered all of the animals, both clean and unclean, along with his family, which included his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. The animals entered the ark in pairs, male and female, just as God had commanded Noah. After 7 days, the floodwaters came upon the earth, and the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. On the same day that the rain started, all the fountains of the great deep were burst open, and the windows of the sky were opened. The flood lasted for 40 days, and the waters increased, lifting up the ark above the earth. The waters prevailed exceedingly, covering all the high mountains that were under the whole sky. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. All flesh that moved on the earth, including birds, cattle, animals, every creeping thing, and every man, died. Only those in the ark were saved, as they were the only ones with the breath of life in them. The flood destroyed every living thing that was on the surface of the ground, including man, cattle, creeping things, and birds of the sky. After the flood, the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. When the waters finally receded, only Noah and those who were with him in the ark were left. Chapter 8. The story of Noah and the great flood is one of the most famous stories from the Bible. In the story, God looked down on the world and saw that it was full of evil and violence, so he decided to start over. He chose Noah, a righteous man, to build an ark and gather 2 of every kind of animal to save them from the flood. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain fell and the waters covered the entire earth. But God remembered Noah and all the animals with him in the ark, and made a wind to pass over the earth, causing the waters to subside. It took 150 days for the waters to recede from the earth, and during that time, the ark rested on Ararat's mountains. Noah waited patiently, sending out first a raven and then a dove to check for signs of dry land. When the dove finally returned with an olive leaf in her mouth, Noah knew that the waters had begun to recede. After waiting another 7 days, Noah sent out the dove again, and this time she did not return. Eventually, in the 601st year, on the first day of the first month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah was able to remove the covering of the ark and see that the surface of the ground was dry. God spoke to Noah, telling him to go forth from the ark with his family and all the animals. They all emerged from the ark and began to breed and multiply on the earth. Noah built an altar to Yahweh and offered burnt offerings, which God found pleasing. God promised that he would never again curse the ground for man's sake, even though the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. He also promised that while the earth remains, there would always be seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night. Chapter 9. In the book of Genesis, there is a story about how God blessed Noah and his sons and instructed them to be fruitful, multiply and replenish the earth. He also gave them dominion over every animal of the earth, bird of the sky, fish of the sea and every living creature on the land. He made it clear that every moving thing that lives would be food for them, just as green herbs were given to them. However, they were not to eat flesh with the life of it or the blood of it. God also warned that he would require the blood of any living creature that was taken, and that whoever shed man's blood, by man, would his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. God established a covenant with Noah, his offspring, and every living creature, including the birds, cattle, and every animal on earth. He promised that he would never again cut off all flesh by the waters of a flood or destroy the earth. The token of this covenant was a rainbow that God set in the cloud, to be seen as a sign of the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. Whenever a cloud appeared, the rainbow would be seen, and God would remember the covenant, and the waters would never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who went forth from the ark after the flood. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from them, the whole earth was populated. Noah became a farmer and planted a vineyard. Unfortunately, he drank too much wine from the vineyard and became drunk. He was uncovered within his tent, and Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, went in backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him. He cursed Canaan, declaring that he would be a servant of servants to his brothers. On the other hand, he blessed Yahweh, the God of Shem, and declared that Canaan would be his servant. He also prayed that God would enlarge Japheth and that he would dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan would be his servant. Noah lived for 350 years after the flood, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, then he died. This story emphasizes the importance of obeying God's commands and establishing covenants with him. It also illustrates the consequences of disobedience, as seen in the curse on Canaan. Lastly, it highlights the importance of familial responsibility and respect, as shown by Shem and Japheth's actions towards their father. Chapter 10. The history of the generations of the sons of Noah and his sons' descendants, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, is recounted. After the great flood, sons were born to them, and they became fathers of many nations. Japheth's sons included Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus, and their descendants settled on the islands and lands, speaking different languages and living in their own families and nations. Ham's sons were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, and his descendants also spread across various regions. One of Ham's descendants, Cush, was the father of Nimrod, who was known for his mighty hunting skills and built the kingdom of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. He also went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin. Mizraim became the father of many descendants, including the Philistines, and Canaan became the father of Sidon, Heth, and many other tribes. Shem, the father of all the children of Eber and elder brother of Japheth, had descendants that include Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. Arpachshad was the father of Shelah, who became the father of Eber, who had 2 sons, Peleg and Joktan. Joktan became the father of Almodad, Shalef, Hazarmaveth, and others, and his descendants lived in the east. Shem's descendants also settled in various regions, speaking different languages, and forming their own families and nations. These were the families of the sons of Noah, and their descendants spread across the earth after the flood. Chapter 11. In the beginning, the whole earth had one language and one speech. As people journeyed east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar where they decided to settle. They discussed making bricks by burning them thoroughly and used tar for mortar. They came up with a plan to build a city and a tower that would reach the sky so that they could make a name for themselves and avoid being scattered across the earth. God, who was called Yahweh, came down to see the city and tower, which the people built. He realized that because they were one people and spoke one language, nothing would be withheld from them, and they could achieve anything they intended to do. To prevent this, Yahweh decided to confuse their language so that they would not understand each other's speech. Yahweh scattered the people abroad from there on the surface of all the earth, and they stopped building the city. The place where this happened was named Babel, which means confusion because Yahweh confused the language of all the earth there. The narrative then moves to the history of the gene equals rations of Shem, who was one of Noah's sons. Shem was 100 years old when he became the father of Arpachshad, 2 years after the flood. Shem lived for 500 years after he became the father of sons and daughters. Arpachshad became the father of Shelah when he was 35 years old. After this, he lived for 403 years and became the father of more sons and daughters. Shelah, his son, became the father of Eber at the age of 30, and he lived for 403 years after this, fathering more sons and daughters. Eber, the son of Shelah, was 34 years old when he became the father of Peleg. Eber lived for 430 years after he became the father of sons and daughters. Peleg, his son, was 30 years old when he became the father of Reu, and he lived for 209 years after this, becoming the father of more sons and daughters. Reu was 32 years old when he became the father of Serug. After this, he lived for 207 years and became the father of more sons and daughters. Serug, his son, was 30 years old when he became the father of Nahor, and he lived for 200 years after this, becoming the father of more sons and daughters. Nahor, the son of Serug, was 29 years old when he became the father of Terah, who went on to become the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Abram and Nahor took wives, with Abram marrying Sarai and Nahor marrying Milcah, the daughter of Haran, who was also the father of Iscah. However, Sarai was barren, and they had no children. Terah, the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran, took Abram, Lot, Haran's son, and Sarai to go to the land of Canaan, but they stopped and lived in Haran. Terah lived for 205 years before he died in Haran. Chapter 12. The story of Abram begins with Yahweh speaking to him and telling him to leave his country, his relatives, and his father's house, and to go to a land that God will show him. Yahweh promises to make Abram a great nation, bless him, make his name great, and make him a blessing. Yahweh also promises to bless those who bless Abram and curse those who curse him, and that all families on earth will be blessed through him. Abram, Lot, and Sarai leave their home in Haran, and Abram is 75 years old. They take all their possessions and journey to the land of Canaan, passing through Shechem where Abram builds an altar to Yahweh. Yahweh appears to Abram and promises to give the land to his descendants. Abram then journeys to the east of Bethel, pitches his tent, builds another altar to Yahweh, and calls on his name. However, a famine strikes the land, and Abram and his family travel to Egypt. As they approach, Abram worries that the Egyptians will kill him to take his wife, who is beautiful. To protect himself, he tells Sarai to say that she is his sister, not his wife. The Egyptians see Sarai and take her to Pharaoh's house, where she is praised and taken as his wife. Pharaoh treats Abram well for her sake, giving him sheep, oxen, donkeys, servants, and camels. However, Yahweh plagues Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, and Pharaoh confronts Abram, asking why he did not tell him that she was his wife. Pharaoh orders them to leave, and they are sent on their way with all their possessions. Chapter 13. Abram, his wife, all that he had, and his nephew Lot left Egypt and traveled to the south. Abram was a wealthy man with plenty of cattle, silver, and gold. They continued their journey from the south to the place where Abram's tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. There, Abram found the place of the altar which he had previously made and called upon the name of Yahweh. Lot, who accompanied Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents. However, the land could not accommodate their substantial wealth, and strife arose between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and Lot's cattle. The Canaanite and the Perizzite also lived in the land at that time. Abram suggested that they separate from each other to avoid further conflict. He gave Lot the choice to pick which land he wanted, and Lot chose the plain of Jordan, which was well watered like the garden of Yahweh, before Yahweh destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot journeyed east and settled in the cities of the plain, particularly in Sodom, where the people were wicked and sinners against Yahweh. After Lot separated from him, Yahweh said to Abram to lift up his eyes and look in all directions, promising him and his offspring the land they see. Yahweh also promised to make his offspring as numerous as the dust of the earth. As a result, Abram moved his tent and lived near the oaks of Mamre in Hebron, where he built an altar to Yahweh. Chapter 14. In the days of several powerful kings, including Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, war broke out with Bera, king of Sodom, and several other kings. These kings joined forces in the Vale of Siddim, also known as the Salt Sea. For 12 years, they served Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer came with other kings and struck down several other groups of people. The king of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also known as Zoar, set up a battle against them in the Vale of Siddim, but they were outnumbered. The vale was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and some fell into the pits. The remaining people fled to the mountain. The enemy kings took all the goods and victuals of Sodom and Gomorrah and left. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who lived in Sodom, and his goods. One person who had escaped told Abram, who lived by the oaks of Mamre. When Abram heard that his relative was taken captive, he led forth his trained men and pursued the enemy kings, as far as Dan. He divided himself against them by night, and he and his servants struck them and pursued them to Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. They brought back all the goods, as well as Lot and his goods, the women, and the people. After Abram's return, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine and blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Abram gave him a tenth of all. The king of Sodom asked Abram to give him the people and take the goods for himself, but Abram refused, saying he had made an oath to Yahweh, God Most High, that he would not take anything that belonged to the king of Sodom, except for the portion that his men had already consumed. Chapter 15. The word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, telling him not to be afraid and that Yahweh would be his shield and great reward. But Abram was worried because he was childless, and his heir would be Eliezer of Damascus. Yahweh promised Abram that he would have a child of his own and that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abram believed in Yahweh and was counted righteous. Yahweh reminded Abram that he had brought him out of Ur of the Chaldees to give him the land as an inheritance. But Abram was still unsure how he would know that he would inherit the land. Yahweh instructed Abram to take a heifer, a female goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Abram did as he was told, and Yahweh instructed him to divide the animals in half and lay each half opposite the other. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and terror and great darkness fell on him. Yahweh spoke to Abram and told him that his seed would be sojourners in a land that was not theirs and would serve the people there for 400 years. But Yahweh promised to judge the nation they served and that Abram's offspring would come out with great substance. Abram would go to his fathers in peace and be buried in a good old age. In the 4th generation, his descendants would return to the land because the iniquity of the Amorite was not yet full. When the sun went down, a smoking furnace and a flaming torch passed between the divided pieces of the animals. That day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, promising to give his descendants the land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, including the Kenites, Kensites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Chapter 16. Sarai, the wife of Abram, was unable to have children. She suggested that Abram have a child with her handmaid, Hagar. After living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai gave Hagar to Abram to be his wife. Hagar became pregnant and began to despise her mistress when she saw that she had conceived. Sarai blamed Abram for this and dealt harshly with Hagar, causing her to flee. The angel of Yahweh found Hagar by a fountain of water in the wilderness and instructed her to return to her mistress. The angel also promised to multiply her seed and that she would bear a son, whom she would name Ishmael. The child would be like a wild donkey among men and his hand would be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Hagar called Yahweh a God who sees and named the well where she met the angel Beer Lahai Roi. Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram when he was 86 years old. Chapter 17. At the age of 99, God appeared to Abram, declaring himself as God Almighty, and instructed Abram to walk before him and be blameless. God promised to make a covenant with Abram and multiply him exceedingly. Abram fell on his face and God spoke, saying that the covenant was with him and that he would be the father of a multitude of nations. God changed Abram's name to Abraham and promised to make him exceedingly fruitful, with kings coming out of him. God established an everlasting covenant between himself, Abraham, and his descendants, giving them the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. God instructed Abraham and his descendants to keep the covenant, with every male being circumcised as a token of the covenant. The uncircumcised male would be cut off from his people for breaking the covenant. God also changed Sarai's name to Sarah and promised that she would bear a son named Isaac, who would establish an everlasting covenant with God. Abraham laughed, thinking it impossible that he would have a child at the age of 100 and Sarah at the age of 90. However, God insisted that he would keep his promise and make Isaac the son of the covenant. God also blessed Ishmael, Abraham's son, and promised to make him a great nation. Abraham, being obedient to God, circumcised himself, his son Ishmael, and all the men in his house on the same day as God had instructed. Chapter 18. One day, Yahweh appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre while he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. When Abraham lifted his eyes, he saw 3 men standing opposite him. He ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself to the earth, saying, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, please don't go away from your servant. Let a little water be fetched so you can wash your feet and rest under the tree. I will get a morsel of bread so you can refresh yourselves before continuing on your journey." The men agreed, and Abraham hurried into the tent to instruct Sarah to prepare food. Abraham fetched a calf from his herd and dressed it while Sarah made cakes. He served the men the food, and they asked him where Sarah was. Abraham told them she was in the tent, and one of the men promised to return to Abraham when the season came round, saying that Sarah would have a son. Sarah, who was behind him in the tent door, laughed within herself, thinking she was too old to bear a child. Yahweh heard Sarah's laugh and asked Abraham why she laughed, saying, "Is anything too hard for Yahweh? At the set time, I will return to you, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah denied laughing, but Yahweh knew the truth. The men rose from the oaks of Mamre and looked toward Sodom. Yahweh told Abraham that he planned to investigate Sodom and Gomorrah's sin, as their cry was great. Abraham asked Yahweh if he would consume the righteous with the wicked, pleading for the city's salvation if there were righteous people present. Yahweh agreed to spare the city for the sake of 50 righteous people, and Abraham bargained with Yahweh, asking if he would spare the city for the sake of fewer and fewer righteous people. Yahweh ultimately agreed to spare the city for the sake of 10 righteous people. After finishing his conversation with Abraham, Yahweh went his way, and Abraham returned to his place. Chapter 19. In the evening, 2 angels came to Sodom and found Lot sitting in the gate of the city. Lot rose to meet them and invited them to stay at his house. Although they initially declined, Lot insisted, and the angels agreed to go to his house. Lot made a feast for the angels, and they ate. However, before they could lay down, the men of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house and demanded that Lot bring out the angels so that they could have sex with them. Lot refused but offered his 2 virgin daughters instead, which the men of Sodom rejected and threatened Lot. The angels intervened and struck the men with blindness, allowing Lot and his family to escape. The next morning, the angels urged Lot to flee the city with his wife and daughters to avoid its destruction. Although Lot hesitated, the angels took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and his daughters' hands, and took them out of the city. The angels warned them not to look back and to escape to the mountain, but Lot asked to go to a nearby city instead, and the angels granted his request. God then rained sulfur and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah and destroyed the cities, and Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt when she looked back. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham saw the smoke from the land rising like a furnace. Lot and his daughters went to live in a cave in the mountains. Lot's daughters, concerned that they would never bear children, made their father drunk and had sex with him to preserve his seed. The elder daughter slept with Lot first, followed by the younger daughter the next night. Both daughters became pregnant, and they gave birth to Moab and Ben-Ammi, who became the fathers of the Moabites and Ammonites, respectively. Chapter 20. Abraham was on a journey towards the land of the south and settled between Kadesh and Shur, where he sojourned in Gerar. Abraham introduced his wife, Sarah, as his sister to Abimelech, the king of Gerar, who subsequently took Sarah. However, God came to Abimelech in a dream and warned him that he had taken a married woman and that he would die as a consequence. Abimelech pleaded his innocence, saying that Abraham had claimed Sarah was his sister, and he had acted with pure intentions. God recognized Abimelech's integrity and withheld him from sinning against him. God commanded Abimelech to return Sarah to her husband, Abraham, who was a prophet and would pray for him. Abimelech was afraid and immediately returned Sarah to Abraham, along with sheep, oxen, and men and women servants. Abimelech also offered Abraham to dwell in his land wherever he pleased. Abraham explained to Abimelech that he thought there was no fear of God in the land and, therefore, had introduced Sarah as his sister. Abimelech gave Sarah 1,000 pieces of silver and vindicated her in front of everyone. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his maidservants, who bore children. Yahweh had closed all the wombs in Abimelech's household because of Sarah. Chapter 21. The chapter 21 tells the story of Abraham and Sarah, and the birth of their son Isaac. As promised by God, Sarah conceived and gave birth to Isaac in Abraham's old age. Abraham named his son Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day, as God had commanded. Sarah was overjoyed at the birth of her son, and Abraham celebrated with a feast when Isaac was weaned. However, tensions arose between Sarah and Hagar, the handmaid who had borne a son, Ishmael, to Abraham. Sarah demanded that Hagar and her son be cast out, and though this grieved Abraham, God told him to listen to Sarah. Hagar and Ishmael were sent away with limited supplies, and when they ran out of water, Hagar left Ishmael under a shrub, unable to watch him die. But God heard the boy's cries, and an angel appeared to Hagar, showing her a well of water and promising that Ishmael would become a great nation. Abraham later made a covenant with Abimelech, a Philistine king, but there was a dispute over a water well. Abraham complained to Abimelech, and after some negotiation, they made a covenant at Beersheba. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree and called on the name of Yahweh, where he and Sarah would sojourn for many days in the land of the Philistines. Chapter 22. In this chapter, God tests Abraham by asking him to offer his son Isaac as a burnt offering in the land of Moriah. Abraham obeys and sets out on the journey with Isaac and 2 young men. On the 3rd day, they arrive at the designated place and Abraham builds an altar, places wood on it, and binds Isaac to it. As Abraham is about to kill Isaac with a knife, an angel of Yahweh intervenes and stops him, recognizing Abraham's obedience and faith. Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught in a thicket, which he then sacrifices instead of his son. The place is named Yahweh Jireh, and the angel of Yahweh appears again, promising Abraham that his descendants will be blessed and will multiply like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, and will possess the gates of their enemies. All nations of the earth will be blessed through his seed, as a result of his obedience to God's voice. After this event, Abraham returns to his young men and they travel together to Beersheba, where he lives. Finally, the narrative tells us that Milcah, Abraham's brother Nahor's wife, gives birth to 8 children, including Bethuel, who becomes the father of Rebekah. Nahor's concubine also bears him 4 children. Chapter 23. The chapter 23 tells the story of Sarah's death and burial as well as the negotiations that took place between Abraham and the people of Heth to secure a burial place for Sarah. Sarah lived for 127 years before passing away in Kiriath Arba, which is also known as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham came to mourn and weep for her. Abraham, being a stranger and sojourner in the land, asked the children of Heth for a possession of a burying place to lay his wife to rest. The people of Heth, recognizing Abraham's status as a prince of God, offered him their tombs to bury his dead. But Abraham wanted to purchase a specific cave, the cave of Machpelah, which belonged to Ephron the son of Zohar, located at the end of his field. Abraham requested that the people of Heth intercede on his behalf with Ephron, to ask him to sell him the cave for a full price. Ephron initially offered to give Abraham the field and cave for free, but Abraham insisted on paying for it. Eventually, Abraham agreed to pay Ephron the 400 shekels of silver that he had asked for, and the field, the cave, and all the trees in the field were made sure to Abraham as a possession before all who went in at the gate of Ephron's city. Abraham then buried Sarah in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave were made sure to Abraham as a possession of a burying place by the children of Heth. This story shows the importance of family burial traditions and how Abraham negotiated to secure a suitable burial place for his loved one. Chapter 24. Abraham, a man who had been blessed by Yahweh in all things, was now old and stricken in age. He spoke to his servant, the elder of his household, who had authority over everything that Abraham owned, and said to him, "Please put your hand under my thigh. I will make you swear by Yahweh, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live. But you shall go to my country, and to my relatives, and take a wife for my son Isaac." The servant asked him, "What if the woman isn't willing to follow me to this land? Must I bring your son again to the land you came from?" Abraham replied, "Beware that you don't bring my son there again. Yahweh, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me, and who swore to me, saying, 'To your descendants I will give this land,' will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. If the woman isn't willing to follow you, then you shall be clear from this my oath. Only you shall not bring my son there again." The servant put his hand under Abraham's thigh and swore to him concerning this matter. He took 10 of Abraham's camels, and departed with all goodly things of Abraham's in his hand. He went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. At the time of evening, he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water, the time that women go out to draw water. He prayed to Yahweh to show kindness to his master and to give him success that day. He said that the young lady to whom he would say, "Please let down your pitcher, that I may drink," should say, "Drink, and I will also give your camels a drink," and should be the one appointed for Isaac. Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her pitcher on her shoulder. The servant asked her for a drink, and she gave him drink. She then drew water for all his camels. The servant took a golden ring of half a shekel weight, and 2 bracelets for her hands of 10 shekels weight of gold, and asked whose daughter she was. When Rebekah replied that she was the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. The servant worshipped Yahweh. He then went to Rebekah's home, where her brother Laban welcomed him, saying, "Come in, you blessed of Yahweh. Why do you stand outside? For I have prepared the house, and room for the camels." The man came into the house, and he unloaded the camels. He gave straw and provender for the camels, and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Food was set before him to eat, but he said, "I will not eat until I have told my message." He then spoke and said, "I am Abraham's servant. Yahweh has blessed my master greatly. He has become great. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old. He has given all that he has to his son Isaac. Now my master made me swear, saying, 'You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I live, but you shall go to my father's house and to my relatives, and take a wife for my son.' I asked my master, 'What if the woman will not follow me?' He said to me, 'Yahweh, before whom I walk, will send his angel with you, and prosper your way. You shall take a wife for my son from my relatives, and of my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath, when you come to my relatives. If they do not give her to you, you will be free from my oath.' So I came today to the spring, and said, 'Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, if now you do prosper my way which I go, behold, I am standing by this spring of water. Let it happen that the maiden who comes out to draw, to whom I will say, Please give me a little water from your pitcher to drink, and she will tell me, Drink, and I will also draw for your camels, let her be the woman whom Yahweh has appointed for my master's son.' Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her pitcher on her shoulder. She went down to the spring, and drew. I said to her, 'Please let me drink.' She hurried and let down her pitcher from her shoulder, and said, 'Drink, and I will also give your camels a drink.' So I drank, and she also gave the camels a drink. I asked her, 'Whose daughter are you?' She said, 'I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Nahor, whom Milcah bore to him.' I put the ring on her nose, and the bracelets on her hands. I bowed my head, and worshipped Yahweh, and blessed Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me in the right way to take my master's brother's daughter for his son. Now if you will deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me. If not, tell me, that I may turn to the right hand, or to the left." Laban and Bethuel both responded, "The thing comes from Yahweh. We can't speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her, and go, and let her be your master's son's wife, as Yahweh has spoken." Abraham's servant was relieved and grateful, and he once again bowed down to the ground before Yahweh. Then he brought out expensive gifts for Rebekah and her family, and they all sat down to eat and drink together. However, early the next morning, the servant asked to be allowed to return to his master. Laban and Bethuel said, "Let the young lady stay with us a few days, at least 10. After that, she may go." But the servant insisted on leaving immediately, saying, "Don't hinder me, since Yahweh has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master." So they said, "We will call the young lady, and ask her." They called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" She said, "I will go." So they sent Rebekah away with Abraham's servant, along with her nurse and maids, and they blessed her, saying, "Our sister, may you be the mother of thousands of 10,000s, and let your seed possess the gate of those who hate them." Then Rebekah and her entourage set out on their journey to meet Isaac. When they finally saw him, Rebekah covered herself with a veil, and the servant told Isaac all that had happened. Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took her as his wife. He loved her, and she comforted him after his mother's death. Chapter 25. Abraham took another wife named Keturah, who bore him 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Madon, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan became the father of Sheba and Dedan, while Midian had 5 sons named Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldaah. Abraham gave all that he had to his son Isaac, but gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from Isaac to the east country. Abraham lived for 175 years and then passed away in a good old age, and was buried in the cave of Machpelah that he purchased from the children of Heth, alongside his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who married Rebekah and had twin boys, Esau and Jacob. The boys struggled together in Rebekah's womb, and God told her that they would be the fathers of 2 nations, with the older serving the younger. Esau was a skillful hunter, while Jacob was a quiet man who preferred to live in tents. Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob. One day, Esau came home hungry and asked Jacob for food. Jacob agreed to give him some stew, but only if Esau sold his birthright. Esau agreed and sold his birthright to Jacob, who gave him bread and lentil stew. Thus, Esau despised his birthright. Chapter 26. In the land where Isaac lived, there was a famine, just like there had been during the days of his father, Abraham. Isaac went to the king of the Philistines, Abimelech, in Gerar. Then Yahweh appeared to him and told him not to go to Egypt but to stay in the land he would show him. Yahweh promised to bless him and his descendants and to give them all the land. He also promised to multiply his descendants and bless all the nations of the earth through them, because of Abraham's obedience to Yahweh's laws. Isaac lived in Gerar and told the men there that his wife was his sister, out of fear that they would kill him for her beauty. Abimelech saw Isaac caressing Rebekah and realized that they were married, not siblings. Abimelech confronted Isaac about lying and putting them in danger of committing adultery. Abimelech warned his people not to touch Isaac or his wife. Isaac sowed in the land, and Yahweh blessed him with 100-fold harvest. He grew very wealthy and had flocks, herds, and a great household. The Philistines became envious of him and stopped the wells his father's servants had dug. Abimelech asked Isaac to leave because he was much mightier than they were. Isaac moved to the valley of Gerar, dug again the wells of water that his father had dug, and found a well of springing water. The herdsman of Gerar argued with his herdsmen over the water, and they dug 3 wells, calling them Esek, Sitnah, and Rehoboth. Isaac left there and went to Beersheba, where Yahweh appeared to him and blessed him, reminding him that he was with him because of his father's obedience. Isaac built an altar and called on the name of Yahweh. Abimelech and his men came to Isaac, wanting to make a covenant with him because they saw Yahweh's blessings on him. Isaac made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. The next day, they swore an oath and left in peace. Isaac's servants told him they had found water, and he called the well Sheba. Meanwhile, Esau married 2 Hittite women, Judith and Basemath, which grieved Isaac and Rebekah's spirits. Chapter 27. Here we find the story of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers with very different personalities. Esau was the eldest, and as such, he was entitled to receive a special blessing from their father, Isaac. One day, Isaac, who was old and nearly blind, summoned Esau and asked him to go out hunting and bring back some game so that he could bless him. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overheard this conversation and immediately knew what she had to do. She went to Jacob and told him to go and fetch 2 goats from the flock. She would then cook them in a way that would make them taste like game, and Jacob could take them to his father and receive the blessing instead of Esau. Jacob was hesitant at first, but Rebekah convinced him to go through with the plan. She made the goats, and Jacob put on Esau's clothes and covered his arms and neck with animal skins to make them feel hairy like Esau's. He then brought the food to his father, who was suspicious at first but eventually ate and gave him the blessing, thinking that he was Esau. When Esau returned from hunting and found out what had happened, he was furious and wanted to kill Jacob. Rebekah sent Jacob away to her brother Laban's house, where he would be safe from Esau's wrath. Jacob would spend the next 20 years away from his family, working for Laban and starting his own family. This story highlights the deceit and scheming that can occur within families, even in the most prominent ones. It also shows how blessings and inheritance can cause strife and division among siblings. Despite the tension and turmoil, Jacob eventually reconciled with his brother Esau, showing that forgiveness and reconciliation can overcome even the deepest wounds. Chapter 28. Jacob was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. When Isaac grew old, he called for Jacob and blessed him, instructing him not to marry any Canaanite women but to go to his mother's family in Paddan Aram to find a wife. So Jacob set out on his journey, traveling towards Paddan Aram. He stopped to rest for the night and used a stone as a pillow. As he slept, he had a dream in which he saw a stairway reaching from earth to heaven, and angels were ascending and descending on it. At the top of the stairway stood the Lord, who spoke to Jacob and confirmed the promises that had been given to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. The Lord promised to give Jacob and his descendants the land on which he was sleeping, and that they would be as numerous as the dust of the earth. The Lord also promised to be with Jacob and protect him wherever he went, and to bring him back to the land. When Jacob awoke, he was filled with awe and fear, realizing that he had been in the presence of God. He took the stone that he had used as a pillow and set it up as a pillar, pouring oil on it as a sign of his consecration to God. He named the place Bethel, meaning house of God, and made a vow to serve the Lord and give a tenth of all that he had to God. From that day on, Jacob's journey towards Paddan Aram was filled with hope and confidence, knowing that the Lord was with him and would guide his steps. When Jacob arrived in Paddan Aram, he met his cousin Rachel and fell in love with her. He worked for her father, Laban, for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. However, Laban tricked Jacob and gave him Rachel's older sister Leah instead. Jacob agreed to work another 7 years for Rachel, and eventually, he was allowed to marry her as well. Despite the deception, God blessed Jacob with many children, and he became the father of 12 sons who would go on to become the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's encounter with God at Bethel marked a turning point in his life. He had left his home and family to find a wife, but he found so much more. He found a deeper understanding of God's promises to his family and a renewed sense of purpose in serving God. Throughout his life, Jacob faced many challenges and struggles, but he always remembered the Lord's promise to be with him and protect him. His story is a testament to the power of faith, and the ways in which God can guide us on our journeys and give us the strength to face whatever challenges come our way. Chapter 29. Jacob had left his home and traveled towards the land of his relatives. He finally arrived at a well in the land of Haran where he saw a group of shepherds gathered. They had a large stone over the well, and they were waiting to water their flocks. As Jacob approached the well, he saw a beautiful woman named Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother. Jacob went over to her and moved the stone from the well so that her sheep could drink. Rachel was so grateful to Jacob for his help and kindness that she ran back to her father's house to tell him what had happened. When Laban heard the news, he rushed to the well to welcome Jacob into his home. After staying with Laban for a month, Jacob fell in love with Rachel and asked for her hand in marriage. Laban agreed to the marriage, but only if Jacob worked for him for 7 years. Jacob agreed to the terms and worked hard for Laban. Finally, the day of the wedding arrived, and Jacob eagerly awaited the arrival of his beloved Rachel. However, Laban had other plans. He deceived Jacob by giving him Rachel's older sister, Leah, as his wife instead. Jacob was angry and felt tricked, but he loved Rachel so much that he agreed to work another 7 years for Laban in exchange for her hand in marriage. So, Jacob married Leah and Rachel, and they lived in the land of Haran with their new family. Despite the difficult circumstances, Jacob was grateful to God for bringing him to this land and blessing him with a family. He worked hard for Laban, and over time, he became very wealthy and successful. Jacob's story reminds us that even in the face of trials and difficulties, God can work in our lives to bring about good things. Chapter 30. Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, but Rachel was barren while Leah had many children. Rachel was jealous of Leah's fertility, and so she gave her handmaid, Bilhah, to Jacob as a wife, so that she could have children through her. Bilhah bore Jacob 2 sons, whom Rachel named Dan and Naphtali. Not to be outdone, Leah gave her handmaid, Zilpah, to Jacob as a wife, and Zilpah bore Jacob 2 sons, whom Leah named Gad and Asher. Time passed, and Rachel still had not borne any children to Jacob. In desperation, she asked Jacob to give her children, and Jacob became angry with her, asking if he was in the place of God. Rachel then suggested that Jacob sleep with her handmaid, Bilhah, so that she could have children through her. Bilhah bore Jacob 2 more sons, whom Rachel named Issachar and Zebulun. Eventually, Rachel conceived and gave birth to a son whom she named Joseph. As time passed, Jacob grew prosperous and his flocks multiplied. He decided to leave his father-in-law, Laban, and return to his homeland. But Laban was reluctant to let Jacob go, as he had become wealthy while working for him. So, they made a deal: Jacob could keep all the spotted and speckled sheep and goats, and Laban would keep the rest. Jacob took branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and peeled away some of the bark in a striped pattern, then placed the branches in the water troughs where the flocks drank. This caused the flocks to give birth to spotted and speckled offspring, and soon Jacob had a large flock of his own. In the end, Jacob had many children and a great wealth of flocks, and he was able to return to his homeland, knowing that he had made a good life for himself and his family. Chapter 31. Jacob had been living with his father-in-law Laban for many years, and he had grown tired of being mistreated and deceived. One day, God spoke to Jacob and told him to return to the land of his fathers. So, Jacob called his wives Rachel and Leah to him and told them of his plans to return home. The women were afraid, as they knew that Laban would not let them leave easily, but Jacob assured them that God would protect them. So, they gathered their belongings and set out on the journey. When Laban heard that Jacob had left, he was furious and set out in pursuit of him. After catching up with Jacob and his family, Laban accused him of stealing his idols. However, Jacob was unaware of any theft and allowed Laban to search through his belongings. Rachel, who had taken the idols, cleverly hid them under her saddle and sat on them, claiming that she could not get up due to her menstrual cycle. Laban eventually gave up his search and made a covenant with Jacob, promising not to harm him or his family. They erected a stone pillar to mark the agreement and called it Mizpah, meaning watchtower, as a symbol of God's watchful presence over them. Jacob and his family continued their journey, and as they approached the land of his brother Esau, Jacob sent messengers to him, hoping for a peaceful reunion. The messengers returned with the news that Esau was on his way to meet them, accompanied by 400 men. Jacob was afraid, as he remembered the last time he saw his brother, he had stolen his birthright and blessing. So, he prepared gifts for Esau and sent them ahead, hoping to appease him. As they met, Jacob fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness, but to his surprise, Esau embraced him and welcomed him home. They wept together, and Jacob was filled with gratitude for God's mercy and protection over him and his family. Chapter 32. Jacob was on his way to meet his brother Esau, whom he had deceived years ago. He was worried that Esau might want to seek revenge on him for stealing his birthright and blessing. As he traveled, Jacob encountered an angel of the Lord and wrestled with him all night long. Although the angel wounded Jacob's hip, Jacob refused to let go until the angel blessed him. The angel then changed Jacob's name to Israel, which means one who struggles with God. The next day, Jacob and Esau met, and to Jacob's surprise, Esau was not angry with him. In fact, Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him, and they wept together. Jacob offered Esau gifts as a sign of his repentance and as a gesture of reconciliation. Afterward, Jacob settled in the land of Canaan, and he built an altar to the Lord. He recognized that God had protected him and fulfilled his promises to him. Jacob's struggle with the angel and his reconciliation with Esau taught him the importance of humility and repentance, and how God's grace can bring healing and restoration to broken relationships. Chapter 33. As the sun rose over the horizon, Jacob and his family packed up their belongings and set out on their journey. They were heading towards Esau's land, hoping to reconcile with him after years of separation. As they neared Esau's land, Jacob sent his servants ahead with gifts for Esau. He hoped the gifts would soften Esau's heart and make him more open to reconciliation. Jacob was also nervous about facing Esau, as he had tricked him out of his birthright years ago. As Jacob and his family approached, Esau was waiting for them with 400 men. Jacob was afraid that Esau was coming to attack them, but he gathered his courage and stepped forward to meet his brother. To Jacob's surprise, Esau embraced him and wept. Jacob was overwhelmed by Esau's forgiveness and kindness, and they reconciled after all these years. Esau asked Jacob about the gifts he had sent, but Jacob insisted that Esau keep them as a token of his appreciation. The two brothers parted ways, with Esau returning to his land and Jacob continuing on his journey. As Jacob looked back on this moment, he knew that he had been blessed with a second chance. He realized that he had been forgiven by his brother and had the opportunity to make amends for his past mistakes. With a renewed spirit, Jacob continued on his journey, grateful for the chance to start anew. Chapter 34. Dinah was a curious and adventurous young woman. She often wandered outside of her father's camp, exploring the surrounding countryside. One day, while she was out on a walk, she met Shechem, the son of Hamor, the ruler of the city of Shechem. Shechem was immediately taken with Dinah's beauty and asked her to marry him. Dinah, however, was not interested in marrying Shechem, and she told him so. Despite Dinah's rejection, Shechem continued to pursue her. He asked his father, Hamor, to go to Jacob and ask for Dinah's hand in marriage. Hamor agreed, and he and Shechem went to Jacob's camp to negotiate the marriage. Jacob's sons, however, were outraged that Shechem had defiled their sister, and they decided to seek revenge. Jacob's sons told Hamor and Shechem that they would only agree to the marriage if every male in the city of Shechem was circumcised. Hamor and Shechem agreed to the terms, and they convinced all of the men in the city to undergo circumcision. 3 days after the circumcision, while the men were still recovering, Simeon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, attacked the city. They killed all of the men, including Shechem and Hamor, and took Dinah back to their camp. When Jacob found out what his sons had done, he was angry and saddened. He feared that the other nations in the area would seek revenge against him and his family. However, his sons defended their actions, saying that they could not allow their sister to be treated in such a way. The story of Dinah and Shechem serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of revenge and the importance of respecting others' boundaries. It also highlights the tensions between different tribes and nations in the ancient world. Chapter 35. After the terrible events in Shechem, Jacob knew he needed to get away. So he gathered his household and all his possessions, and set out for Bethel, the place where God had first spoken to him. He told his family to get rid of all their foreign gods and purify themselves, for they were about to approach the holy God of their ancestors. As they journeyed, The surrounding towns and villages trembled at the sight of Jacob's large family and great wealth. But God protected them, and they arrived safely in Bethel. Jacob built an altar there, and called the place El Bethel, which means God of Bethel, in remembrance of the covenant God had made with him there years ago. At Bethel, God appeared to Jacob once again and spoke to him. He reaffirmed the name he had given Jacob, Israel, meaning he who struggles with God, and promised him many descendants and the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. Jacob was overwhelmed with gratitude, and he set up a memorial stone at the spot where God had spoken to him. Sadly, the journey to Bethel had been too much for Jacob's beloved wife Rachel. She went into labor and gave birth to a son, but she died from childbirth complications. Jacob was devastated, but he named the child Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. His father, however, changed the child's name to Benjamin, which means son of my right hand, a name of blessing and favor. With Rachel's death and burial near Bethlehem, the chapter ends with Jacob returning to his father Isaac in Hebron, and the genealogy of Esau is recounted. Despite the trials and tragedies he had faced, Jacob knew that God was with him and would fulfill his promises. Chapter 36. The chapter 36 is a genealogy detailing the descendants of Esau, the older twin brother of Jacob. This chapter lists the descendants of Esau, also known as Edom. He took 3 wives from the land of Canaan and had many children through them. Esau and his wives had several sons, including Eliphaz, Reuel, Jeush, Jalem, and Korah. Eliphaz had a son named Teman, while Reuel had a son named Nahath. Esau also had a daughter named Timnah. As the genealogy continues, we see that the people of Edom became powerful and numerous, with their own kings before any king ruled over Israel. This chapter concludes with a list of Edomite kings who reigned before Israel had a king. 1. Bela son of Beor. 2. Jobab son of Zerah. 3. Husham of the land of the Temanites. 4. Hadad son of Bedad, who defeated Midian in the country of Moab. 5. Samlah of Masrekah. 6. Saul of Rehoboth on the river. 7. Baal-Hanan son of Achbor. 8. Hadar, also known as Hadad, son of Bedad, who defeated the Midianites in the country of Moab. Chapter 37. Jacob, also known as Israel, had 12 sons, but Joseph was his favorite. He loved Joseph more than his other children and gave him a beautiful coat of many colors. Joseph's brothers became jealous of him, and their envy grew stronger each day. One day, Joseph had a dream and told his brothers about it. He dreamed that they were all binding sheaves of wheat in the field when suddenly his sheaf stood up and the others bowed down to it. His brothers were angry and asked him if he thought he was going to rule over them. A few days later, Joseph had another dream, and he told his family about it again. This time he dreamed that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to him. Jacob, his father, scolded him and asked if he thought his mother, father, and brothers would all bow down to him. One day, Jacob asked Joseph to go and check on his brothers who were out tending their flocks. As soon as they saw him coming, they plotted to kill him, saying that he thought he was better than them. However, Reuben, the oldest brother, convinced them not to kill Joseph but to throw him in a pit instead. They planned to leave him there to die. When they were eating their meal, a caravan of Ishmaelites passed by, and Judah, another brother, suggested they sell Joseph as a slave to the Ishmaelites instead of leaving him in the pit. So they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, and he was taken away to Egypt. The brothers then took Joseph's coat, dipped it in goat's blood, and showed it to their father, telling him that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. Jacob was heartbroken and mourned for his son, not knowing that he had been sold as a slave. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Despite being a slave, Joseph was blessed by God and found favor in Potiphar's sight. He was put in charge of Potiphar's household and prospered. Thus, Joseph's story of betrayal and suffering began, leading him on a journey that would eventually bring him to a position of great power and influence in Egypt. Chapter 38. Judah, one of Jacob's sons, had left his family to settle in the land of Canaan. He married a Canaanite woman and had 3 sons with her. The firstborn was named the second Onan, and the third Shelah. When grew up, Judah found him a wife named Tamar. However, was wicked in the eyes of the Lord, and he died childless. According to the law of the time, Onan was then required to marry Tamar and father a child in his brother's name. But Onan refused and spilled his seed on the ground, so the Lord also put him to death. After this, Judah was afraid to give his third son, Shelah, to Tamar in marriage. He told her to wait until Shelah was old enough to marry, But he had no intention of keeping his promise. Tamar waited, but Shelah never came for her. One day, Judah's wife died, and he went to Timnah to shear his sheep. Tamar heard that he was coming and decided to take matters into her own hands. She disguised herself as a prostitute and sat by the side of the road, waiting for Judah to come by. When Judah saw her, he did not recognize her and propositioned her. Tamar agreed, but asked for a pledge as collateral until Judah could pay her. Judah gave her his signet ring, his cord, and his staff. Tamar conceived from this encounter and later was found to be pregnant. Judah found out and ordered her to be burned to death. But Tamar produced the signet ring, cord, and staff that Judah had given her, proving that he was the father of her child. Judah was ashamed and acknowledged that Tamar was more righteous than he was. Tamar gave birth to twin sons, Perez and Zerah, who became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. And so, the story of Judah and Tamar demonstrates that even in the midst of human sin and deceit, God's plan and purposes can be fulfilled. Chapter 39. Joseph was sold as a slave by his own brothers, but as the Lord was with him, he found favor in the eyes of his Egyptian master, Potiphar. Potiphar put Joseph in charge of his household and everything he owned, for he saw that the Lord was with Joseph and blessed everything he did. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and Potiphar's wife took notice of him. Day after day, she tried to seduce Joseph, but he refused her advances, saying, "My master has entrusted me with everything in his household, except you. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Despite his refusal, Potiphar's wife continued to proposition Joseph. One day, when no one was around, she grabbed his cloak and demanded that he sleep with her. But Joseph fled from her, leaving his cloak behind. When Potiphar returned home, his wife accused Joseph of trying to rape her, showing him the cloak as evidence. Potiphar was furious and had Joseph thrown into prison. But the Lord was with Joseph even in prison, and he found favor in the eyes of the prison warden. He was put in charge of all the prisoners, and the warden saw that the Lord was with him and blessed everything he did. While in prison, Joseph met two of Pharaoh's officials who had been thrown into jail. They both had troubling dreams, and Joseph interpreted their dreams for them. He told one of the officials that he would be restored to his former position, but he asked the other official to remember him and plead his case to Pharaoh. Years passed, and the official forgot about Joseph. But the time would come when the Lord would raise Joseph up and use him to save many people from famine. Chapter 40. Joseph was in prison for quite some time, and eventually he was joined by two other prisoners, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of Pharaoh. One night, both of these men had dreams that troubled them. The next morning, Joseph saw that they were both looking sad, and he asked them what was wrong. They told him about their dreams, and Joseph interpreted them. To the chief cupbearer, Joseph said that in 3 days, Pharaoh would restore him to his position as cupbearer. And when this happened, Joseph asked him to remember him and tell Pharaoh about his situation, since he had been unjustly imprisoned. To the chief baker, Joseph had a different interpretation. He said that in 3 days, Pharaoh would have him hanged and birds would eat his flesh. Everything happened just as Joseph had predicted. On the 3rd day, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, but the chief baker was hanged, just as Joseph had said. Unfortunately for Joseph, the chief cupbearer forgot about him for 2 years, leaving Joseph to languish in prison. But this experience would later prove to be a significant one for Joseph, as it helped prepare him for the even greater responsibilities that lay ahead. Chapter 41. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had 2 troubling dreams that left him feeling uneasy. He dreamt of 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, and in his second dream, he saw 7 healthy ears of grain devoured by 7 thin and withered ones. None of his wise men could interpret his dreams, and this left him even more worried. At this time, Joseph, a Hebrew man who was once sold into slavery by his own brothers, was imprisoned in Egypt. The chief baker and butler of Pharaoh were also imprisoned along with him. One night, both the baker and butler had strange dreams, and they were upset because they couldn't understand them. Joseph, with God's help, interpreted the dreams of the baker and butler accurately. The baker would be hanged, and the butler would be restored to his position. Joseph asked the butler to remember him and speak to Pharaoh on his behalf, but the butler forgot about Joseph once he was released. 2 years later, Pharaoh had his troubling dreams, and the butler suddenly remembered Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. Pharaoh sent for Joseph, who interpreted the dreams as a warning from God of 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh appointed him as the overseer of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Joseph used the 7 years of plenty to prepare for the upcoming famine, and his actions saved countless lives in Egypt and the surrounding regions. Thus, Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams led to his rise in power in Egypt, and he became known as a great and wise leader. Chapter 42. Jacob had sent his 10 sons to Egypt to buy grain, as there was a severe famine in the land of Canaan. Little did they know, the one they were buying from was their long-lost brother, Joseph, whom they had sold into slavery years ago. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but they did not recognize him. He treated them harshly, accusing them of being spies, and putting them in jail for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he released them, but only after they agreed to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, to him as proof of their honesty. The brothers returned home with the grain and told their father what had happened. When they discovered that they could not return to Egypt without Benjamin, Jacob was deeply distressed. He had lost Joseph, and he could not bear the thought of losing Benjamin too. But the famine was severe, and they had to return to Egypt to buy more grain. When they did, Joseph saw his brother Benjamin and was overcome with emotion. He treated his brothers kindly, providing them with food and gifts, and sent them home with more grain. When they left, Joseph hid a silver cup in Benjamin's sack and accused him of stealing it. The brothers were devastated, knowing that their father would be heartbroken if they returned without Benjamin. Joseph demanded that Benjamin stay with him as his slave, but Judah pleaded with him to take him instead, saying that their father would not survive the loss of another son. At this point, Joseph could no longer control himself and revealed his true identity to his brothers. They were stunned and filled with remorse for what they had done to him. Joseph forgave them and urged them to bring their father and their families to Egypt, where he would provide for them. The brothers returned to their father and told him the amazing news that Joseph was still alive and was the ruler of Egypt. Jacob could hardly believe it, but when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him to Egypt, he knew that it was true. He gathered his family and all their possessions and set out for Egypt, where they were reunited with Joseph and lived happily ever after. Chapter 43. After Judah's plea for his brother Benjamin's life, the brothers and their father Jacob returned to Egypt. They brought gifts for the governor and presented themselves before him. Joseph saw his brothers and asked about their father's health. Then he noticed Benjamin and was deeply moved. He had to leave the room to compose himself. When Joseph returned, he ordered a feast to be prepared for his brothers. But they were afraid and thought they were being lured into a trap. Reassuring them, Joseph sat them in birth order and served them special portions of food. Benjamin received 5 times more than the others. After the meal, Joseph's steward returned their money to their sacks. He also put Joseph's silver cup into Benjamin's sack. As the brothers were leaving, Joseph's steward stopped them and accused them of stealing the cup. He searched their sacks and found it in Benjamin's. The brothers were distressed and didn't know what to do. They returned to Joseph and offered to become his slaves. But Joseph said he would only keep the one who had the cup. Seeing how upset his brothers were, Judah pleaded with Joseph to let Benjamin go and take him as a slave instead. He explained how much Benjamin meant to their father and how his father would die of grief if he lost another son. Joseph was touched by Judah's words and revealed himself to his brothers. They were shocked and afraid, but Joseph embraced them and told them not to be afraid. He explained that everything that had happened was part of God's plan. He instructed his brothers to go back to their father and bring him and their families to live in Egypt where they would be taken care of. Overwhelmed with emotion, the brothers fell to the ground and thanked Joseph. They returned to their father Jacob and told him that Joseph was alive and was ruler over all of Egypt. Jacob was initially stunned, but then he gathered his things and set out to see his son Joseph. Chapter 44. After the feast and the silver cup incident, the brothers returned to Joseph's house. They were terrified and anxious about what would happen next. Joseph's steward welcomed them and took them to Joseph's house, where they fell down before him. Joseph asked them, "Why did you do this to me? Don't you know that I can predict the future?" Judah replied, "What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has found us out for our sins, and now we are your slaves." But Joseph said, "I will not take all of you as my slaves. Only the one who had my silver cup will remain with me. The rest of you can go back to your father in peace." Then Joseph's steward searched their bags and found the cup in Benjamin's bag. The brothers were devastated, and they tore their clothes in grief. They returned to Joseph's house, and Judah pleaded with Joseph to let Benjamin go, saying that their father would die if Benjamin didn't return. Judah even offered to take Benjamin's place as a slave. At this point, Joseph could no longer control himself, and he revealed his identity to his brothers, saying, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers were speechless and frightened, But Joseph reassured them and asked them to bring their father and their families to live in Egypt. Joseph forgave his brothers for selling him into slavery, saying that it was all part of God's plan to save many lives. He then gave them carts to take back to their father, filled with food and provisions for their journey. The brothers went back to Canaan and told their father the incredible news that Joseph was still alive and was the governor of Egypt. Jacob was overjoyed and traveled to Egypt with his entire family to reunite with his long-lost son. Chapter 45. Joseph could not hold back his tears any longer. He had been waiting for this moment for years, the moment when he would finally reveal himself to his brothers. They had no idea that the powerful Egyptian ruler before them was their long-lost brother whom they had sold into slavery so many years ago. "Please come closer to me," Joseph said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." The brothers were stunned. They could hardly believe what they were hearing. They had never imagined that the governor of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself, was their own flesh and blood. They had come to Egypt to buy food during the famine that was ravaging their homeland, and they never expected to find their brother, let alone be reunited with him. As they stood there, Joseph explained to them that it was all part of God's plan. He had been sold into slavery, but God had been with him all along, even in the darkest moments of his life. God had raised him up to be a powerful leader in Egypt so that he could save many lives during the famine, including those of his own family. The brothers were overwhelmed with emotion. They fell to their knees and begged Joseph's forgiveness for what they had done to him so many years ago. Joseph, however, assured them that there was no need for forgiveness, that God had used their evil deeds for good. After that emotional reunion, Joseph gave his brothers food and provisions for their journey back to their homeland. He also sent gifts to his father, Jacob, and urged his entire family to come to Egypt to live with him, where he promised to care for them and provide for their needs. As the brothers left Egypt, their hearts were filled with wonder and gratitude. They marveled at how God had worked all things together for good, even their own sins and failures. They knew that they had been given a second chance, a chance to start over and to live in the light of God's grace and mercy. Chapter 46. After a long and tiring journey, Jacob and his family arrived in Egypt. They had come to be reunited with Joseph, whom they had believed to be dead for so many years, and to escape the famine that had devastated their homeland. As they entered the land, Jacob offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac, who had promised him that his descendants would become a great nation. Jacob hoped that this move to Egypt would be the beginning of the fulfillment of that promise. Joseph came to meet his father and his brothers in the land of Goshen, where he had prepared a place for them to live. When Jacob saw Joseph, he was overwhelmed with joy and embraced him tightly. Joseph wept as he held his father, and Jacob thanked God for the miracle of their reunion. Joseph introduced his family to Pharaoh, who was impressed with the wisdom and skill of the sons of Israel. Pharaoh gave them permission to settle in the land of Goshen, where they could raise their flocks and herds. The family began to thrive in Egypt, and Jacob's descendants multiplied greatly, just as God had promised. Jacob lived to see his great-grandchildren grow up around him, and he knew that his legacy would live on through his family. As he neared the end of his life, Jacob called his sons to him and blessed each one, prophesying about their future and the future of their descendants. He knew that God had great plans for his family, and he was grateful for the chance to be a part of it. In the end, Jacob died in Egypt, but his family continued to thrive and grow. His descendants would go on to become the great nation that God had promised, and the story of their journey to Egypt would be remembered for generations to come. Chapter 47. After Joseph revealed his true identity to his brothers and reunited with his father Jacob, he brought them to Egypt and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was pleased to meet with Jacob and asked him how old he was. Jacob replied, "The days of the years of my sojourn are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourn." Pharaoh then asked Jacob to bless him. Jacob blessed Pharaoh and then asked to settle his family in the land of Goshen. Pharaoh granted his request and Joseph settled his family there, providing for them during the famine. As the famine continued, Joseph's brothers and their families ran out of money and had to sell all their livestock and land to the Pharaoh in exchange for food. Joseph continued to provide for them and their families, but he also increased Pharaoh's wealth and power in the process. When the famine had spread throughout the land, Joseph exchanged food for money and then for livestock, land, and eventually even the people themselves. He allowed the people to work the land and keep 20% of the harvest for themselves, while the rest went to Pharaoh. In this way, Joseph saved his family and the entire land of Egypt from the devastating effects of the famine. His wisdom and leadership proved crucial in the survival of his people and the preservation of their way of life. Chapter 48. After spending many years in Egypt, Jacob was old and sick. One day, Joseph went to visit his father with his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Jacob saw them, he said, "Who are these young men?" Joseph replied, "They are my sons, whom God has given me in this place." Jacob said to Joseph, "Bring them to me, so that I may bless them." Jacob's eyes were weak with age, so he could not see very well. Joseph brought his sons close to Jacob, and Jacob kissed and embraced them. Jacob said to Joseph, "I never thought I would see your face again, and now God has let me see your children too." Then Jacob said to Joseph, "I am going to bless these boys, but first, tell me which one is your oldest son." Joseph pointed to Manasseh and said, "He is my oldest son." Jacob put his right hand on Manasseh's head and his left hand on Ephraim's head. However, Jacob intentionally crossed his hands, putting his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh. Joseph tried to correct his father, saying, "No, my father, this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head." But Jacob replied, "I know, my son, I know. Manasseh will also become a great nation, but his younger brother will be greater than him, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations." After blessing the boys, Jacob said to Joseph, "I am about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. I give you one more portion than your brothers, which I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow." With that, Jacob blessed them both and returned to his rest. Chapter 49. After living a long life, Jacob called his 12 sons to his bedside and said, "Gather around me so I can tell you what will happen to you in days to come." His sons gathered around him, and he began to speak. "Reuben, you are my firstborn, and as such, you were once the strongest and most powerful of my sons. But you were reckless and impulsive, and you slept with my concubine Bilhah. Therefore, you will no longer be the firstborn or receive the greatest inheritance. Simeon and Levi, you are brothers and have the same fate. You used your anger to kill many men and are violent and destructive. Therefore, I will disperse you among the other tribes. Judah, you will be the strongest of my sons. Kings will come from your line, and you will lead the tribe of Judah with power and authority. Zebulun, you will live by the sea and become a haven for ships. Issachar, you will be a strong and hard-working laborer, but you will also be a servant to others. Dan, you will be a fierce and cunning judge and will protect your tribe. Gad, you will be raided by raiders, but you will fight them off with skill and courage. Asher, you will be wealthy and enjoy the finest things in life. Naphtali, you will be a swift deer who produces beautiful fawns. Joseph, you are my son, who has suffered greatly, but you will be blessed with land and property. Benjamin, you are a fierce warrior who strikes with the speed of a wolf, and your tribe will grow to be a strong nation." After blessing all of his sons, Jacob died and was mourned by all of his children. His sons then fulfilled his request and buried him in the tomb of his ancestors. Chapter 50. After Jacob died in Egypt at the age of 147, Joseph ordered his servants to embalm his father's body according to the Egyptian custom. He then mourned for his father with his family for 7 days. After the mourning period, Joseph asked Pharaoh's permission to go to Canaan with his family and bury Jacob in the field of Machpelah, the burial site of his ancestors. Pharaoh granted Joseph's request and even sent officials and chariots to accompany him and his family on their journey. Joseph took his father's body with him and all his brothers, except for the youngest, Benjamin, who remained in Egypt. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan River, Joseph and his family stopped to mourn again for his father. They wept loudly and bitterly, and the local people named the place Abel Mizraim, which means mourning of the Egyptians. After they had mourned for his father, Joseph and his family continued on their journey to Canaan. They arrived at the field of Machpelah, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah were buried. Joseph and his brothers buried Jacob there, and then returned to Egypt. After Jacob's death, Joseph's brothers became afraid that he would seek revenge on them for selling him into slavery. They sent a message to Joseph, saying that their father had instructed him to forgive them. Joseph wept upon hearing this message, and he reassured his brothers that he had no intention of harming them. He told them that what they had meant for evil, God had used for good, by sending him to Egypt ahead of them to save them from the famine. Joseph lived in Egypt with his family for 110 years. He lived to see his great-grandchildren, and he made the Israelites swear an oath to carry his bones back to the land of Canaan when God would deliver them from Egypt. Then Joseph died at the age of 110 and was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Thus, the book of Genesis ends with the story of Joseph, who went from being sold into slavery to becoming a powerful ruler in Egypt and ultimately reuniting his family. Thanks for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one.